to Simon and Helga for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here as the first person to inaugurate this series of talks, and it's great to be in Copenhagen. So I just want to introduce a little bit this lecture that I'm going to give, or this talk tonight. So as what I tend to do in lectures in this format, so spoken rather than written words, is usually I tend to just kind of try and string together several ideas and themes that I'm working on as a way of testing them out live, to see how they hold up and if I can get them to connect in some way. So that's what I'm going to do today in response to this invitation to give a lecture under the heading Why Words Now. I'm going to bring together some thoughts in 3 different sections. Firstly, about writing in relation to art objects and material things in general. Secondly, about writing, which conceives of language as material and introduces the idea of the material imagination. And finally, how these subjects relate to a new writing project I'm currently engaged in. But as I say, I really just want to kind of roll these ideas out, see how much they stick together, rather than kind of present a very tightly formed argument with a kind of very watertight conclusion. So there's a lot of different stuff that I've kind of gathered together that I'm going to kind of throw out, and if anybody has questions at the end about any of it, then please do feel free. It would be really nice to have some kind of discussion afterwards if that works out. So, this is a very kind of unwieldy title for a lecture: Visions and Intermediaries, Language and the Material Imagination. It's not exactly a snappy title, but those were the words I came up with for this question, why words now? And I have to admit that for me it's hard not to be a bit defensive when faced with this question as a writer. Why words now? Words are my medium, they're my tool. And I'm committed to the resilience of words. For me, words are a way to get to the root of a problem. First, as a means for me to understand what I'm faced with, and then to translate this understanding in a way that hopefully others can access as an act of transference. Get more light. So, why words now? In Marguerite Duras' book, Writing, this was one of her last works published in 1993, there's a chapter titled The Death of the Young British Pilot, which has to do with the war and with the difficulty of mourning the death of those one doesn't know, of someone who dies far away from their home. Faced with the gravestone of a foreign soldier long since dead, and the fact that he was afforded a dignified burial on what was at the time ostensibly enemy ground, Duras finds words failing her. "There is nothing I can say," she writes. "There is nothing I can write." She continues, "There should be a grammar of non-writing. Someday it will come, a brief writing without grammar, a writing of words alone, words without supporting grammar, lost, written there, and immediately left behind. A writing of non-writing. Is this what is asked for when someone asks, why words now? Writing always involves a commitment of some kind, and when words seem to fail, not able to live up to what is asked of them, then it feels like there is nothing to say, nothing to write. But even in saying this or writing this, we are bound again to the power of language. Expression demands words. There is no way around it. I initially came to writing as a tool and a medium as an art critic. This meant that I use language in relation to things as a result of a kind of forensic attention applied to art objects or art experiences. I began this work in 2001 when I moved to Berlin. For a few years before that, I'd been working with art and artists in a gallery in New York. But after doing that for 4 years, I remember suddenly realizing that my relation to these art objects had shifted. I was so concerned with their various logistical aspects, their production, their transportation, their exhibition, their sale, that I was barely able to see them anymore. I realized that I wanted to get back to writing, to using language as a means to see again, and to understand what I was looking at. So I want to introduce a handful of separate things to illustrate this way of working with words. 4 separate unconnected examples of artworks which tie into some of my recent research and teaching, looking at how existing objects have been employed in artworks, and the kinds of transfigurations that occur in order for these things to become carriers of wider meaning. So I'd like to introduce these 4 works as the visions I refer to in the title of this lecture. This image is a kind of talisman for me, a record of an encounter with a material thing that description can barely capture. I saw it in an exhibition in Berlin in 2016, Lutzbacher's work, The Silence of the Whale. Lutzbacher was born in 1943, lived most of her life in California, and her works since the early 1970s traffic in a kind of displacement. In fact, even her artist persona itself is an act of displacement, taking a male European pseudonym applied to a Bay Area woman who was in her 70s when she passed away last year. An anchor is a particularly descriptive object. Its form and material are so closely linked to its purpose. But this one was neatly severed in 2, dislocating top from bottom, an action that short-circuited the object's meaning. A solid iron anchor weighing several tons, it required 3 piano carriers to bring it up the stairs. But here it lies, nonchalantly on the parquet floor of the gallery in Berlin-Charlottenburg, far from where it would normally be found, on the deck of a ship or at the bottom of a body of water. Here in the gallery, it was almost impossible to conceive of the anchor's enormous weight, and you could no longer even imagine its purpose. The anchor's lack of functionality due to the severance of top from bottom seems to create a mystery about this thing that reaches beyond its visual appearance. Plus, there is its title, The Silence of the Whale. Another contradiction, given the huge mass of these creatures. Are they really silent, gliding massively through the ocean? And if so, why? The Silence of the Whale as a title is an enigma that is equivalent to the enigma of the non-verbal art object. Meanwhile, any description of the experience of its encounter seems to slip between words, impossible to convey in all its strangeness. This unforgettable object is emblematic of the inconclusiveness of Backer's works, and writing about it is the challenge that my kind of work enjoys. When I first saw this piece, I was thinking a lot about anchors, about what could constitute an anchor in a life or to a place, about what could make one feel fixed. These thoughts were leading me to an investigation into the nature of place and inhabitation that I'll talk about later. But because I had these thoughts in the back of my mind already, an encounter with this work intersected with them in a generative and unexpected manner. Such alignments and intersections, also between different objects brought together in one space, generate their own forms of partial knowledge, sketching out lateral trajectories of thought, like ley lines or energy fields. Though tuning into the resonance of the stuff itself, these things can remain silent while articulating ideas about violence, loss, or love. Backer's works remain beyond clear comprehension, as if they're somehow oceanic. They cannot be contained by reason or sensation, or reduced to simple meaning. The artist herself, meanwhile, is always disappearing, behind the pseudonym, behind the unauthored objects, in the intersections between things. This sequence of in-between spaces and near misses is where meaning itself emerges. Now, the second of my chosen artworks, Katie Noland's Bloody Mess. Many of us who saw Katie Noland's show at the MMK in Frankfurt last year were struck by the fresh materiality of her works. How relevant not only their hardware, but also their sentiments were, despite the fact that Noland stopped showing new work and withdrew from the art world in 2000 at the age of 44. To experience Noland's works firsthand is to experience a jolt of recognition, an electrified déjà vu, as if we can suddenly see, or maybe read, the hardware that surrounds us and structures our daily encounters as evidence exposing everyday brutality, oppression and exclusion. This work from 1988 is titled Bloody Mess. When I visited the show, however, I was also struck by the descriptions of the works, which were lists of words laying out their constituent components. There was something about the brute factuality of these lists that seemed to come close to the experience of the works themselves. Their jarring, raw juxtapositions, the fact that nothing was extraneous to the works beyond these things brought together as evidence. In a small publication called Picpus, I published a text that was simply a list of the components of selected works by Noland from 1984 to 1994. This is not my usual kind of writing at all, but here it seemed to fit, as if the layers of language beyond the facts of these things themselves were unnecessary. There is nothing I can say. There is nothing I can write. Could this be a kind of writing of non-writing, a writing of words alone, words written there and immediately left behind? Beneath the deadpan language of these inventories and beyond the blank functionality and easy availability of the objects that Noland's works employ, the alternative semantic code that they lay out, beyond these things is a terrain of latent potential. Every individual moves daily through various forms of intrinsic structural violence, whose blanket familiarity blinds us to their violent nature. In K.D. Noland's work, there are barriers, gates, and fences. There are handcuffs, shock absorbers, metal pipes, holsters, belts and buckles, chains and baseball bats, scaffolding and walking aids. Noland's works expose the abstract forms of violence intrinsic in these things. Between 1984 and 2000, using few objects and materials, she very quickly created something that is less a style than, in fact, a language. These objects tell us very succinctly just what, in fact, is going on. Genskin, camera, window, mirror. These are large-scale outdoor projects by German artist Genskin, born in 1948. Each is an elegant, tilted frame of steel, separate works made in the 1990s. Although their forms are very similar, each is described with a different term. This is Camera from 1990. This is Window from 1998. This is Mirror from 1992. These terms, labels, are used as a way to describe and affect experience and perception. These three notions suggest a rich method through which to approach a framing of reality and relations between an individual and a place. It is a phenomenological approach that has to do with means of perception, interpretation, and subjectivities, of being what Genskin likes to call a world receiver, actively taking in signals from the world at large. In his book, The Phenomenology of Perception, Maurice Merleau-Ponty writes, "Reality is not a crucial appearance underlying the rest. It is the framework of relations with which all appearances tally." This framework of relations as something that is actual and underlying seems to me to be what is framed by these three words by Genskin and drawn attention to by their titles. So this is the last of my artwork examples. Juliet Lightman, New York, 2008. "I hope one day soon you'll come visit me here," was the title of the debut show by British artist Juliet Lightman, born in 1980 at Gallery Bortolozzi in Berlin. The show consisted of 3 rooms and 3 meditations on voyages that never took place. In the first floor gallery, which used to be an apartment, Lightman switched off the lights, hung a thin white curtain before each window, and placed a house plant either on the windowsill or on the floor beside it. Each room had a small label on the wall with the title and date of each of the 3 works: London 2011, New York 2008, which is this one, Lucca 2008. Otherwise the gallery was totally empty. Stories behind each imagined trip were typed up by the artist and available to the visitor on request. At the time when I saw this exhibition, I was annoyed by it. It seemed redundant, kind of infuriatingly reduced, almost nothing at all. But the experience of seeing it stayed with me and resonated strangely in my own memory and imagination. These three rooms with their subtle intimations of early diffused light when waking in a strange place. Not only did it propose an overlaying of place, London, Lucca, or New York laid temporarily over Berlin, but also a substitution of one individual and another. The artist's experience replaced by that of the exhibition visitor. So I'm showing these works to suggest how my focus as an art critic has been on things rather than on words, but that words and things are never quite separate. In writing about art, words can act as an intermediary. They translate the weight of the art experience, not just the objects or the events themselves, but what happens between the object or event and the mind of the viewer and the body of the viewer. This energy transfer, this affect as a real space, translated into words, becomes an occurrence that can be shared. Although words are the medium I use, however, for a long time, the writing felt so dependent on the thing it hooked itself onto the art itself, that I didn't give much thought to the words as a material. I didn't consciously engage with the materiality of language. Which brings me to the second part, words, writing, about writing. I'm going to begin with a quote. When a poem happens, meaning and a shared imagination happen between a poet and a reader. The poem is the testimony. The poet and reader are in mental and aesthetic and then spiritual communion. End of quote. This is poet Dorothea Lasky writing in her book Animal, a collection of 4 lectures about poetry, ghosts, colour, and animals. Lasky continues, poems are special because they make a space, a real space, where we can all go. This place is a city called the imagination. So I've borrowed this term, the material imagination, from an essay, one of these essays in Lasky's book. It's the first essay, the first lecture that's been transcribed in this book, and in it she writes about the shared imagination and its ability to engage with the material world. And she argues that the imagination is a physical space that one shares with other people in and through poetry. So obviously poetry is a different category of language to the kind of writing that I'm involved in. The way words are made to act and language is put to use in a poem is a whole other game to the kind of that occurs in art criticism or narrative non-fiction writing. Nevertheless, imagination has a vital role to play in these kinds of writing as well. And the way Lasky describes it as becoming a physical space that one shares makes me think of the way these artworks I discussed before have affected me in ways that go beyond their material objective. To have a vision of something, writes Lasky, to perceive in a visionary way is to assume in some way that what we see is real or weighty, is affected by gravity, is material. She talks about her experiences of seeing ghosts and being a believer or a non-believer as a way to demonstrate the imagination as a real space. Quote, as a poet, I think a lot about belief, the belief in what my mind might bring to me. There are lots of things that enter my mind that I choose to translate into language. All poems contain images, and these images have been in the poet's brain and hang in the balance always, to be given to the reader upon reading. And in a poem, images have weight, so that you cannot help but believe in them." End quote. Juliet Lightman's Curtained Window or Lutzbacher's Severed Anchor have this kind of weight, beyond their actual weight as things in the world. This comes from their having been in the artist's brain and hanging in the balance. They have a weight that you cannot help but believe in, but only if you are a believer. So writing about these visions means entering into the materiality of the imagination and finding an equivalence for it through language, which functions as an intermediary in the sharing of experience. Marguerite Duras' description of the redundancy of words is how I feel at the beginning of writing every text I care about. There is nothing I can say. There is nothing I can write. To try to articulate in words the experience of an artwork in a way that can take in ambiguity but still remain clear is the challenge every time. But as I said, I didn't really spend much time thinking about words per se until around 5 years ago, when I began to be attracted by writings by writers about writing. And this moment 5 years ago was about the time when writers like Eleanor Ferrante and Karl Ove Knausgaard were starting to appear everywhere with their particular kind of auto-fiction. But during this period, it was also the time when I read Marguerite Duras' book, Writings, for the first time, and works by British author Deborah Levy, particularly a slim book called... Oh, something's happened. Hold on just a second. This book called Things I Don't Want to Know, published in 2013 and written as a response to George Orwell's 1946 essay, Why I Write. So in this book, Levy describes a year in her childhood when, as she put it, words left her and she did not speak at all. Quote, "Every time I was asked to speak up, to speak louder, the words ran away, trembling and ashamed." End quote. Having been told to speak her thoughts out loud, she decides to write them down instead. Quote, "I found a biro and had a go at writing down my thoughts. What came out of the biro and onto the page was more or less everything I did not want to know." End of quote. Words, and in particular written words, have the power to access emotional reservoirs or experiences perhaps otherwise unavailable. Levy writes, "It is always the struggle to find language that tells me it is alive, vital, and of great importance." In a recent book called The Cost of Living, which Levy calls her living autobiography, she writes, "All writing is about looking and listening and paying attention to the world. For most of my writing life, the part of the world I've been paying attention to has been that of artworks. Once I started to think about language, however, to read writings by these authors and ask myself the question, why I write, suddenly all kinds of other material started to present itself as possible subject matter." In Things I Don't Want to Know, Deborah Levy writes about an experience she had in 1988 that turned up in a novel she wrote 2 decades later. Quote, "This novel, it seems, is what I'd been gathering evidence for 20 years before actually writing it." A few pages later, she writes about an encounter, a minor event, but one that she uses to show how understanding accumulates through incident and overheard fragments of conversation. "I made sure I barely looked at her," she writes about the woman in question. "But I reckoned I was a detective gathering evidence for something neither of us could fathom." I recognise this sense of gathering evidence, of experiences being possible material, of it all being research. How writing is anchored in looking, listening, and paying attention to the world. How the subject itself is fathomed in the end through words, stringing them into sentences until language unfolds to form a landscape and a meaning of its own. At the moment, I'm using words to try and fathom a problem that has to do with inhabitation, terrain, history, memory, and the act of being a witness. The subject matter, the problem that needs solving, is the view from my kitchen window. The view I see framed by my kitchen window is material, but it's also a riddle looking for an answer. This view began presenting itself to me insistently at the same time as a series of unrelated accidents, broken pipes, a leaking roof, some badly connected appliances, brought on repeated occurrences of water damage in the apartment we'd moved into. Feng Shui says this is a sign of grief. The water element breaks its banks, and the house itself is weeping. The view outside my window, meanwhile, was hypnotising me, so I set myself the task to write a portrait of the city, Berlin, from the view this window frames. I've been living in this city for 18 years already, and I don't know why I felt the urge now to try and grasp it, except that the house itself seemed somehow to suggest it. A house built 150 years ago on the banks of the Landwehr Canal, in the west, but looking east. I had thought about living on the water as a way to find a current. Conversely, to write about the place I live could be a way to make an anchor, to counteract the drift. But this subject, the city, refuses to be neatly contained or firmly grasped. The writing has become sprawling and unruly, and so it begins to resemble the city itself, Berlin, spread out wide without any discernible banks, one big, lonely city. I was already gathering evidence for this before even being aware that the house had become my subject. My attention was being grabbed by certain fragments of text or pictures or conversations. The house itself, could it but get a voice, would speak out all too clear. This was one such thing I picked up from a lecture by the poet Anne Carson. What would this house have told us in the century and a half that it stood on the banks of the Landwehr Canal, in a place so marked by disappearance? Dorothea Lasky writes about the bidirectionality of the seeing one to the thing being seen. I'll read that again. The bidirectionality of the seeing one to the thing being seen, suggesting that in every act of seeing is an equivalent act of being looked back at, which means, she writes, that all vision and imaginative space created between two things has weight. My subject has to do with the past, but it is more crucially about how the past affects the present, about this physical space between past experience and current manifestation, and how this has weight, how the past is inscribed in the terrain on which we walk every day, or lives with us in the rooms which we inhabit. This is a kind of energy. It is real in the way Lasky talks about. It is material, but it's not visible. And this is where language comes in. Through language, one can become a new eyewitness and write down the evidence of how things are. This condensation of layers of time, these folds of impression, experience, and inhabitation. So, why words now? Because words and language are the material of the present. Why I write is to try and trawl through the stuff that is already there and harness its contradiction and ambiguities. To learn from Lutz Bacher or Katie Noland, from Marguerite Duras or Deborah Levy, and approach the things of the world with a divining sense, equipped with belief. To translate these things into language and use it to forge a new kind of sense in which ambiguity can remain and mystery is a gift. That is the end of my lecture.